She was screaming his name into the trees, her voice cracking on the second syllable, and there was no answer, just the wind moving through the branches and the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. And Sarah kept calling, kept yelling, kept begging the woods to give her something back, but there was nothing, just silence, and behind her the backyard gate was swinging open, the latch broken again, the same latch her husband had promised to fix last weekend. And beyond that gate was nothing but dense Tennessee forest, miles of it, stretching into the foothills of the Smoky Mountains, and their dog Max, a 4-year-old German Shepherd mix, was pacing at the tree line, barking, whining, his whole body tense, and Sarah's husband David came running from inside the house, his face pale, and he said the word she already knew. He said Ethan isn't inside, he's not in his room, he's not anywhere, and Sarah felt her legs nearly give out. And then Max did something that made her stomach drop even further. He bolted, he ran straight into the trees without looking back, and Sarah screamed her son's name one more time, and David grabbed her arm, and they both stood there at the edge of the woods, watching their dog disappear into the shadows, and for a moment, everything went quiet, and all Sarah could think was, how did this happen? How did we get here? Because just 2 hours ago, everything was fine, everything was normal. And that's the thing about moments like this. They don't announce themselves, they don't give you a warning, they just arrive and tear everything apart. And to understand how a perfect Saturday afternoon turned into the worst nightmare of this family's life, we need to go back to the beginning of that day, back to when the sun was still high and warm, and the biggest worry Sarah had was whether she'd remember to defrost the chicken for dinner. It was early October in the hills outside Knoxville, that perfect time of year when the leaves were just starting to turn and the air had that crisp edge to it that made you want to spend every minute outside. And the Hendersons had lived in their house for almost 3 years now, a modest 2-story home at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac that backed up against several hundred acres of protected forest land. And when they'd first moved in, Sarah had worried about the woods, had mentioned to David that maybe they should put up a higher fence, but David had said the trees were part of the charm, part of why they'd bought the place, and besides, their son Ethan was only 4 back then, too young to wander far, and they had Max, who had been part of their family since before Ethan was born, and that dog never let Ethan out of his sight, not for a second. Ethan was 6 now, a curious, adventurous boy with a gap-toothed smile and an endless fascination with bugs, rocks, sticks, and anything else he could find in the backyard, and he'd been playing outside that afternoon while Sarah worked on some emails at the kitchen table by the window, glancing up every few minutes to make sure he was still there, and David was in the garage organizing tools, and it was just a regular Saturday, nothing special, nothing out of the ordinary. And at one point, Ethan had come inside for a juice box and mentioned something about wanting to go into the woods, wanting to see what was past the fence, and Sarah had smiled and told him that the woods weren't for little boys to explore alone, that there were steep hills and creeks and it was easy to get lost, and Ethan had nodded like he understood, and then he'd gone back outside with Max following close behind, and Sarah had turned back to her emails. And she didn't think about it again, because Ethan was a good kid, he listened, and Max was always watching, always protecting, and that should have been enough, that should have been more than enough, but sometimes enough isn't enough, and sometimes even the best kids get curious, and sometimes a broken gate latch changes everything. Sarah didn't know exactly when it happened, couldn't pinpoint the exact moment, but at some point during the next hour, while she was on a phone call with her sister and David was still in the garage, Ethan noticed something at the edge of the yard. Maybe it was a butterfly, maybe it was the way the sunlight was filtering through the trees, maybe it was just the pull of curiosity that all children feel when they're told they can't go somewhere, and he walked toward the fence, toward the gate, and he pushed on it, and it swung open, because the latch had been loose for weeks, and suddenly there was nothing between him and the forest, and Ethan looked back at the house, and then he looked at the trees, and in that moment, in that split second of decision-making that 6-year-olds aren't equipped to handle properly, he stepped through, and Max, who had been lying in a sunny spot near the porch, lifted his head immediately, his ears perking up, and he watched Ethan disappear past the tree line. And the dog hesitated for just a moment, looking back at the house, looking at the place where his owners were, and then he made his choice, and he followed, because that's what Max had always done, that's what he was built to do, and within seconds, both the boy and the dog were gone, swallowed by the forest, and nobody inside the house had any idea. The next 45 minutes passed like any other Saturday afternoon. Sarah finished her phone call, David came inside to wash his hands, They talked about dinner plans, and it wasn't until Sarah went to call Ethan inside for a snack that the world fell apart, because she opened the back door and called his name, and there was no answer, and she called again, louder, and still nothing, and she walked out into the yard, her heart starting to beat faster, and that's when she saw the gate swinging open in the breeze, and that's when she realized Max wasn't in the yard either, and that's when she started screaming. David called 911 while Sarah ran along the tree line, calling Ethan's name until her throat was raw, and the dispatcher told them to stay calm, told them that search and rescue teams would be notified, told them that most children who wander into wooded areas are found within the first few hours, but Sarah didn't hear any of that. All she heard was the blood rushing in her ears and the terrible silence coming from the forest, and within 20 minutes, the first police officer arrived, and then another, and then a volunteer coordinator from the local search and rescue team, and they started asking questions. What was he wearing? How long had he been gone? Did he have any food or water? Was there anywhere in the woods he might have tried to go? And Sarah could barely answer because her mind was stuck on one thought. It was getting late, the sun was already starting to sink toward the horizon, and the temperature was dropping, and her baby was out there somewhere in those endless trees. And she didn't know if he was hurt or scared or lost or all three. And the search and rescue coordinator, a weathered man named Tom who had been doing this for 30 years, looked at Sarah with kind eyes and told her that they were going to find her son, that kids are tougher than we think, that the forest wasn't that dense, but Sarah could see something in his expression that terrified her, because she could tell he was worried about the fading light too. Meanwhile, deep in the woods, Ethan had stopped walking, and he was trying very hard not to cry, but it wasn't working. The tears were coming anyway, rolling down his cheeks and dripping off his chin, because everything looked the same, every tree looked like every other tree, and he had been sure he could find his way back, he had been so sure, but now he had no idea which direction home was. And his knee was bleeding from where he had tripped over a root a while back, and his hands were scratched from catching himself on the rough bark, and it was getting cold, really cold, and the shadows were getting longer. And that's when he heard the rustling behind him, and his heart nearly stopped. But then Max emerged from the undergrowth, his tongue hanging out, his eyes locked on Ethan, and the relief that flooded through that little boy's body was so intense that he started crying harder, and he dropped to his knees and wrapped his arms around the dog's neck and buried his face in that warm fur, and Max stood perfectly still, letting himself be held, letting himself be the anchor that Ethan needed, and in that moment, neither of them knew exactly how to get home. But at least they were together. And that mattered more than Ethan could understand. Back at the house, the search operation was growing, more volunteers were arriving, official search dogs were being brought in, grids were being mapped out, but the light was fading fast, and everyone knew that once darkness fell completely, the search would become exponentially more difficult, and Sarah was pacing, unable to stand still, unable to do anything useful, and David was talking to the search coordinator, getting updates, trying to stay composed, and neither of them had mentioned Max yet, because in the chaos of discovering their son was missing, the dog had become an afterthought. But now Sarah was starting to think about it, starting to realize that Max had gone into those woods right after Ethan, and she didn't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing, and she didn't know if Max could protect Ethan from whatever dangers were out there, but she hoped, God she hoped, that wherever her son was, he wasn't alone. In the forest, the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees, and Ethan was shivering, his thin jacket not nearly enough for the October evening, and he had started walking again, because Max had nudged him with his nose and started moving in a direction that seemed purposeful, and Ethan didn't know if the dog knew where he was going, but following Max felt better than standing still, so he walked, one hand gripping the fur on Max's back, and they moved through the trees together, and what Ethan didn't realize, what he couldn't have known, was that Max was tracking, not toward home, but along the path they had come, circling back, following scent trails that were invisible to human senses, pausing every few minutes to lift his nose to the air, adjusting direction, recalibrating, doing what generations of breeding and instinct had designed him to do, and he stayed close to Ethan the whole time, never getting more than a few feet ahead, always circling back to check, always making sure the boy was still there, still moving, still okay. They walked for what felt like forever to Ethan, and the forest got darker, and the sounds got scarier, and his legs were so tired he could barely lift them, and then they came to a creek, not a big one, just a shallow ribbon of water cutting through the forest floor, but to Ethan it looked like an obstacle, it looked like something he needed to cross to keep going, and he stepped toward the bank, and his foot slipped on the wet rocks, and he started to fall forward, toward the water that was colder than it looked, toward rocks that could have hurt him badly, and that's when Max moved, faster than thought, grabbing the back of Ethan's jacket in his teeth and pulling, yanking the boy backward, away from the creek, onto solid ground, and Ethan landed on his bottom in the leaves, startled but safe, and he looked at Max with wide eyes, and the dog just stood there, positioned between Ethan and the water, and then Max did something that would change everything. He started barking, loud. Persistent barking, over and over again, the kind of barking that carried through trees and echoed off hills and traveled distances that human voices never could. A quarter-mile away, one of the search team members stopped walking and held up his hand, and everyone around him went silent, and they listened, and through the forest, faint but unmistakable, they could hear a dog barking, and the team leader grabbed his radio and called it in, possible auditory contact, eastern quadrant. Everyone moved toward the sound, and suddenly the search had a direction, had a purpose, had hope, and the team started moving faster, following the barking that never stopped, that kept going, and Sarah, who had insisted on joining the search despite everyone telling her to stay at the house, heard the radio chatter, heard someone say they could hear a dog, and she started running before anyone could stop her, crashing through the undergrowth, following the flashlight beams ahead of her, and David was right behind her, both of them running toward that sound, running toward their son. They found him sitting against a tree, with Max pressed against his side, and Ethan was shivering and crying and his face was dirty and his clothes were torn, but he was alive, he was whole, he was okay, and when he saw his mother's flashlight, when he heard her voice, he started crying harder, reaching out his arms, and Sarah dropped to her knees and pulled him against her chest so hard she thought she might break him, and she was sobbing, making sounds she didn't even know she could make, and David wrapped his arms around both of them, and Max finally stopped barking, finally went quiet, and he just sat there, watching his family reunite, his job done. The paramedics checked Ethan over and found nothing worse than scrapes, bruises, and mild hypothermia, all treatable, all temporary, and they wrapped him in warming blankets and carried him out of the forest as his parents walked on either side, and Max walked behind them, never losing sight of the boy. And when they finally got back to the house, when the police cars and ambulances started pulling away, when the neighbors who had gathered started going home, Sarah sat on the living room floor, with Ethan in her lap and Max lying at her feet, and she couldn't stop touching both of them, couldn't stop reassuring herself that they were real, that they were there, that this nightmare was over. Later that night, after Ethan had been bathed and fed and tucked into his parents' bed because nobody was letting him out of their sight, Sarah and David sat in the kitchen with cups of coffee they weren't drinking, and they didn't say much, because what was there to say, but they both understood, both felt the weight of how close they had come, how easily this story could have ended differently, and they looked over at Max, who was lying in the doorway where he could see both the kitchen and the hallway that led to their bedroom, still watching, still guarding, and Sarah thought about all the things that had to go right for their son to come home safe, and she realized that most of those things came down to one decision, one moment, one dog who chose to follow when nobody asked him to, who chose to stay when he could have come home, who chose to bark when his boy needed to be found, and she didn't have words for that kind of loyalty, didn't have a way to express what Max had done for their family, so she just got up from the table and walked over to him and sat down on the floor beside him and put her arms around his neck, and Max leaned into her, and that was enough. In the weeks that followed, things changed in the Henderson household, not dramatically, not in ways that outsiders would notice, but in small ways that mattered. David finally fixed the gate latch and added a lock for good measure, and they enrolled Ethan in an outdoor safety course at the local nature center, and they talked more openly about the woods, not making them forbidden and therefore irresistible, but explaining them, respecting them. And Ethan seemed to understand in a way he hadn't before, because he had learned something in those hours among the trees, something about consequences and fear and love, and Max got a new bed and extra treats and more walks than he probably wanted, but mostly he just got held more, petted more, thanked more, not with words, but with presence, and that was something Max understood. The thing is, when you hear a story like this, it's easy to focus on the drama, the fear, the rescue, but what stays with you isn't the panic, it's the quiet moments. After, it's the realization that loyalty doesn't ask for permission and protection doesn't wait for instructions, it's the understanding that sometimes the ones who love us know what we need before we do, and they follow us into the dark places not because they're brave, but because leaving us alone there was never an option. So here's what I want you to think about tonight. I want you to think about the one who would follow you anywhere, the one who wouldn't leave you even when everything got scary, and I want you to appreciate them while you can, because that kind of love is rare and precious and worth holding on to. Would your dog follow you anywhere? Tell me about them in the comments. I want to hear your stories. And if this one moved you, share it with someone who trusts their dog with their whole heart, because sometimes we all need to be reminded that the best protection comes with 4 legs and a wagging tail.